Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And I appreciate the enthusiasm, especially on a sunny Saturday. We don't get too many of these in February and March, so I appreciate everyone being here. Today I'm going to talk about a research program that we have. For about 2 decades now, we've worked in countries around the world looking at the factors that affect the development of optimal performance in elite athletes. And so we've worked in Australia and Germany and the UK. This year, or actually last year, I was around the globe twice in Qatar and Norway. And this year I'm in Australia and Norway again. And we've spent a lot of time looking at these things, trying to understand the social and environmental factors that affect optimal performance in athletics. Some of the more recent work that we've been doing, though, has shifted gears. We've started to look at older adults, trying to understand the things that they're capable of. And it might surprise you to know that a lot of the factors that affect high-performance athletics and maintenance of skill and performance in older people are the same. And so you might look at these 2 areas of research and say they're pretty different, but we found that the mechanisms, the kind of underlying factors that affect performance and function are the same. And so I'll talk to you today about older athletes and what they can tell us about optimizing our performance as we get older. We'll look a little bit at some of the things that they do right, and we'll discuss whether they're a good model for us to use for the aging process. And then hopefully we'll have lots of time for questions at the end. For me, this started with a question that I've had. I think one of my fundamental questions that I think that has driven my inquisitiveness throughout my whole life is, what are we capable of? I came from a really low socioeconomic status family. They didn't value education. They didn't value sport and physical activity. And I was a relatively late comer to the areas of sport. And it wasn't until I was 16, 17 years of age that I started to really get interested in physical development. From there, I became a triathlete. I've done the Ironman. I've done over a dozen marathons. I've run ultra marathons. And if you look at my background, it doesn't seem to fit with what we think an athlete needs to come from. I didn't have parents that valued sport. Both my parents died very young from lung cancer-related issues. And so what are we capable of was a really fundamental question for me. We like to use in our lab sport as a microcosm or as a unique environment for understanding this question. Because if you think about sport, who are the people that make up athletes and sport competitors? These are people that are highly motivated. They do high levels of training in the best environments with the smartest coaches, with the greatest amount of resources. And they're showing us what our potential is as a species. And so we use sport as an example of what our species is capable of. So here's an example. This is performance times in the Boston Marathon, arguably the most celebrated and important marathon on the planet. It's been around since 1897. And you can see here, performance over time continues to improve, right? We have very little understanding of what the absolute limits of our performance are in this event. There's some discussion that within the next decade or 15 years, we're going to break the 2-hour barrier for the marathon, which 15 years ago they thought, like the 4-minute mile, that's an unbreakable barrier. But anytime we set up these arbitrary barriers, our species seems to thrive in knocking them down. And so when we talk about what we're capable of, this is really an open question. We don't know the limits of our capabilities. We don't know, there are certain hard limits of physics. We know we're never going to run the 100 meters in less than a second. That just is not going to be possible. But is it possible to break 9 seconds? Is it possible to break 8 seconds? We don't know the answers to these questions, and they provide a really rich environment for us to explore the limits of our capabilities as a species. So this has been the fundamental question of our research area. understanding high performance sport. I do a lot of work with On the Podium. Yesterday I was working with the National Wheelchair Basketball Program. And so we do a lot of work in this area, but more and more of our research time has been spent looking at understanding the mechanisms of elite performance. So for example, these sports, very rapid, very fast. In ice hockey, pucks are shot at goalies at over 100 miles an hour. Same thing with elite tennis serves. The speed at which these things are happening to people in sport is amazing and difficult for us to comprehend. We used to think that there was something genetically different about these people, that goaltenders have beyond the realm of human understanding reflexes and reaction time. That the reason that they're able, elite tennis players are able to intercept serves that are coming at 110 miles an hour is because their reaction times are so fast. We know that's not true. We know that the reason they're able to do that is because they've learned how to do it through decades of practice. So tennis players, for example, when they look at a serve that's coming at them from an opponent, they read the body cues of what that server is going to do, and they start to anticipate that movement even before the server has made contact with the ball. The amount of time it takes your brain to process perceptual information is very slow. We say very slow in this context. So if I was to give you a visual display and ask you to press a button as soon as you saw a light change from red to green, it would take around 250 milliseconds for you to respond to that stimulus. That's a quarter of a second. Now think about a tennis serve, let's just say 100 miles an hour, coming at you at 100 miles an hour. Now you don't just have one response, not just pressing a bar. That's really simple. But you've got to predict, is it going to the right or to the left? What's the timing of that serve so I can be in the right place in time, not just to make contact, but to hit it in the right way so that it lands in the place where you want it to go. That's an amazingly complex task that we're asking our brain to do. And we know that in these complex interactive sports, it's almost entirely due to experience. How do we know that? Well, if we take a tennis player and we put them in a squash scenario or a badminton scenario, they look just like an average person. They look just like a novice. And so it's something that they've learned over thousands of hours of practicing tennis, the ability to do. Their brain has restructured in a very sophisticated and very domain-specific way to allow them to do that in that context only. The idea that we'd have a gene that would show up in only one context doesn't make any sense. And so we know that this is a learned capability. That's going to be important in our discussion today. The idea that a lot of these things, a lot of these performances that we think are superhuman are actually the brain's unique ability to evolve and to adapt to the demands we place on it is a critical conclusion for us. So since we've been doing this work, since around the mid-1990s, we've started to look at the application of the same kind of thinking in different areas. And so we've started to ask the question, what are older adults capable of? What's the limit of functioning that we can aspire to as we age? Just like the questions in sport, this is a completely open question as well. So I'll give you a couple examples and try to convince you of this. One of the reasons we were interested in this work is because of some research that we did that just completely blew us away. So this is a quote from 1998 by a couple of leading researchers in the area of aging, that of all the humans who have ever lived to the age of 65, half of them are currently alive. We don't think of aging that way. We think of it as a normal part of our developmental process. It's not. Aging is a relatively new thing for our species, right? And so that creates unique social problems. We know this because look what's happening to healthcare. Look what's happening to proportions of our tax dollars that's going to pay for chronic care of the elderly population. These are social problems that are emerging that we should have been able to predict decades ago. This is a social problem, but it's also a really cool opportunity. And I'll try to convince you of that. The reason why we're in the situation that we're in is multifactorial, but I'm going to look at two specific areas. This is the demographic profile of Canadians as it moves through time. And between 1946 and 1964, the baby boom generation happened. And as they've moved through the areas of development, when they were teenagers, when they were early adults, when they were in midlife, they forced society to restructure itself, right? We're seeing that now in older age groups. Mandatory retirement is going, if it's not gone in most occupations, it's going to be gone soon, because mandatory retirement at 65 doesn't make sense if the average lifespan of people is in the 80s. And so we're forced to restructure ourselves, society, partly because of this big blip right here, which represents the baby boom generation. They're forcing us to make these changes. They're good changes, we should be making them, but that's where a lot of this emphasis is coming from. The other important factor is this study showing, that was published in Science in 2002, showing the increase in life expectancy since 1840. It's been described as the most linear relationship ever identified in behavioral science. Since 1840, lifespan has increased at 3 months per year every single year. So every single year, our lifespan is increasing by 3 months, and it shows no sign of stopping. There is some discussion that if anything is going to stop it, it's the young generation of today that shows greater signs of heart disease and diabetes. And so that might be the thing that ultimately stops this. There's a counter argument that argues that medical technology is advancing so fast that we're going to wipe out conditions like diabetes and heart disease by the time they become seniors. Who knows, but this relationship means that we're continually getting older as a population. So this is quite an interesting question then. What are older adults capable of? If we can understand this, if we can put things into place where we can allow them to maximize their skills or maintain those skills for longer periods of time, that's going to inform a lot of these problems that we're having. We can keep them in the workforce longer. We can keep them out of chronic care homes longer because we're helping them maximize their level of functioning and their independence. And so this is a really socially important question. For us, it's a much more important question than the whole elite athlete development thing, but it's interesting how the players in understanding this relationship are sometimes the same. So this is Robert Marchand. He's a 102-year-old cyclist. Last year, he broke the world record, his own world record, for how many kilometers cycled in a 1-hour period. Robert's not sitting back and sort of resting on his laurels. He's continually testing himself against his level of capability. That's an important message. This is Ed Whitlock. Ed Whitlock's a runner from Milton. He holds the distinction of being the fastest 70-year-old on the planet. When Ed was 73, he ran the fastest ever marathon for someone over the age of 70. He actually holds the records for under 60 as well. Ed is a phenom. If we put Ed's time against our Boston Marathon profile here, Ed Whitlock at the age of 73 ran that time. The only person over the age of 70 to break 3 hours for the marathon. So look at this graph. In 100 years, we've gone from the fastest person in the world being able to run 2 hours and 52 minutes to now people over the age of 70 being able to run that fast. This tells us a lot about what older people are capable of. The problem is most people don't know or don't embrace these kind of accomplishments. We've done a lot of work talking about people like Ed Whitlock or Robert Marchand, and when we talk to seniors and we say, what do you think of this accomplishment? Do you think these people are role models? They say no. They say the equivalent of, these people are freaks. They say they don't represent my experience as an older person. And so on the one hand, we have these people who are achieving amazing, amazing feats as seniors and as older adults, but we can't get people to buy into that message. They're too quick to be dismissed as anomalies, or that level of functioning as being impossible for me to achieve. Oftentimes, older people's beliefs about older people are extremely negative, right? We live in a culture that values youth, maybe youth above all else, right? If you think about why people want to be rich, they want to be rich so that they can hold on to their youth longer or pretend to hold on to their youth longer. We think about what beauty looks like. It's typically young, it's typically thin, it's typically white. There's all sorts of stuff wrapped up in that description, but if we just focus on the youth part, that's how we define ourselves a lot of the times. How I used to be as opposed to how I am. Have a look at these. None of these, all of those are accurate and true representations. That elderly people crossing sign is from Florida. This is the message that older people get, right? Forget about if you want to maintain functioning and you believe that you're an Ed Whitlock or a Robert Marchand. You live in an environment that will make it very, very difficult for you to embrace that way of life as an older person. If you don't believe me, next time you're at the grocery store and you see the way cashiers talk to senior citizens. They talk to them like they're children. These are people that have 6, 7, 8, 9 decades of life experience, and they talk to them like they're kids. Right? That's the environment that we live in. And so over the last probably 15 years or so, we've started to explore this research question. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we've explored, and hopefully it'll inform a bit of a question and answer at the end of the talk. One of the things we've been looking at for about 10 years now is how do aging stereotypes affect older adults' health and performance. So just the stereotype that North American society endorses, how does that affect health and functioning? In order for it to have any consequence, we need to see the following chain of events. This exposure to ageism that we see in our society has to lead to some sort of internalization. If it doesn't, well, it's not great, but it's no big deal. It's when older people internalize that stereotype. There's some really interesting studies that show that we start to internalize negative stereotypes about older people by the age of 4. So think about stories that you hear, right? What do old people look like in nursery rhymes and things that we teach our kids? They have long beards with long hair. They're frail. They have canes. They have big warts. Whatever fairy tale you listen to, almost always the profile that you get of the older person in that story is a negative one, at least compared to the things that we value in society, which are youth and vitality and those kind of things. The only thing where we don't see this kind of profile of aging, this sort of endorsement of negative stereotypes, and it might surprise you, is for pharmaceuticals like Cialis and Viagra. Right? Those are the only time where you see older people as being vital and being full of energy. So this is a serious problem. Not only does it lead to us and for the younger people in the room, if everything goes right, we're going to become older people. That's different than every other stereotype we have, right? We have a society now that says it's not okay to make fun of or to comment on people's sexual orientation or their gender or their race, but we can still make negative comments about people's age and think that's okay. That's a problem. It's a problem because internalization of the stereotype leads to consequences on our health, on our functioning, on the way that we look at the world, the way that we make healthcare decisions. One of the studies that we did looking at a data set from Manitoba where they followed older people from midlife into later life. They followed them for 30 years. We analyzed some data that found that your exposure to ageism predicts your attitude towards aging. So more exposure to ageism affects your attitude. That attitude predicts chronic disease status. It predicts your likelihood of getting heart disease. It predicts your ultimate longevity, your mortality, how long your lifespan is. If your attitude is poor, you die earlier. That's kind of the ultimate health outcome. What's really neat is researchers at Yale University had older people come into a room and then they primed them with either a positive or a negative stereotype and asked them to make decisions about their health care. And they found that if you prime them in a negative way, they'll choose life-sustaining healthcare decisions less often than if you prime them in a positive way. The problem with that study is that the environment we all live in is giving negative primes to old people every single day with everything they do. So these things lead to health problems, health consequences. How do they do that? Well, they affect your attitudes towards preventive behaviors. So we've shown that people with poorer attitudes about aging are less likely to go to their physician for their regular checkup. They're less likely to do things like physical activity, which is necessary for maintaining function. There's some interesting qualitative research that shows that people with poorer attitudes, when they wake up in the morning and they have a sore back, they're more likely to just say, well, that's because I'm getting older. If you're 25 and you wake up with a sore back, you don't say that. But sometime in our life, we think, yeah, I'm getting older. Health problems are just the name of the game. We need to fight against that, right? Every time you wake up and you've got a new ache, it should be an indication that you need to go and figure out what's going on. But somewhere in our lifespan, we get to the point where we think, well, that's just normal. That's just part of the process. So our research looks at that, and we found that those stereotypes can be a big factor in affecting the level of functioning, the level of health, the level of vitality that older people have. So for us, another important question became, well, what is an accurate profile of age-related decline? We don't want to live in a world of sunshine and rainbows where we say that aging doesn't exist. That's not true. Aging happens, but can we understand what's the level of functioning that we can hope to attain as we get older? So we've started looking at people who participate in an event called the World Masters Games. Has anyone here heard of this? Okay, so a few people. It's amazing that everybody hasn't heard of this, and I'll try to convince you why. Well, first off, this is a phenomenon that started in Toronto. It's been in Canada 3 times. It started in 1985. Since there, every 4 years they have it again. A couple of years ago they had it in Torino, Italy. 2 years from now it's going to be in Auckland, New Zealand. And so it's a really rich event for us because it provides people, older people, who are at the highest levels of functioning. And so we can look at their performance, how it changes over time, and get a good idea of, well, maybe these are the kinds of levels of functioning that we should be aspiring to. What's surprising that most people haven't heard of this is because it's the largest multi-sport event in the world. It's 3 times bigger than the Olympics. There's over 30,000 people that participate in the World Masters Games. But I bet no one here has seen it on a sports page. Right? When I was in Australia for the World Masters Games, the only time we saw it in the sports page was when someone who was over the age of 100 did something. Right? It doesn't even matter what they did. If they did something, it was on the sports page. That's good, but it's not an indication of the kind of coverage we would hope to see. And it still feeds into this idea that older adults who are doing these amazing things are freaks and anomalies, as opposed to representing the kind of potential that we might have. This is some data from the World Masters Games. And so what I've done here is I plotted the performance, relative performance in different types of events. So this is sprint performance for males. The female data looks exactly the same. And what I've done is looked at it by age and by performance decrease relative to 100%. So these are percentages that you're seeing on the y-axis here. Regardless of whether we look at sprint or middle distance running or middle distance events or long distance events, we see a relatively similar profile, that it's a relatively consistent rate of decline as we get older. So age, big surprise, aging exists, okay? That's what these data are showing. What's interesting, though, is that these represent the absolute potential of people at different points in their lifespan. Now, I'm going to argue that except for a really small proportion of the population, none of us are anywhere near our absolute potential. But if we look at the average person, we still see this linear rate of decline. Okay, memory, task, reaction time, all those kind of things still decline at this predictable rate that we see here in the optimal levels of performance. Why does this happen? Well, it might surprise you to know that if we look at the population as a group, the most active you ever are in your whole life is during adolescence. From that point on, it's a continual decrease in physical activity, decrease in activities that challenge you. And so part of this decline, and we would argue in our lab, a large part of this decline is because of disuse, because of inactivity. If we statistically test this and we put amount of activity people are involved in, it cancels out every other variable. It cancels out age. And so we know that this rate of decline probably has more to do with behavior, how much you're challenging yourself, how much physical activity you're doing, all those kind of things, than it has to do with age. It looks like age because we normally plot it by comparing age groups, but it probably has more to do with behavior patterns than it actually has to do with age. And this is for sprint, middle, and long distance sporting activities are a bit more biological in the way that they predict performance. How fast you can run from there to there is a biological and physiological question. If we look at tasks where you have to learn how to perform it, like let's say we wanted to look at golf, for example, which is a learned skill. It requires a lot of fine motor skill. There's some gross stuff in there as well, absolute power, driving a golf ball off a tee. If we look at golf performance over time, we see a completely different profile. That's what golf performance looks like. What this data show is that the things that we've learned how to do, those things that take us a long time to master, are much more resistant to age than things that are determined by our biology, how fast we can run from one point to the next. So things like driving, chess skill, the ability to type, those kind of things are much, much more resistant to aging than we think they are. We think that they go down when we age, but if we keep involvement, these are golfers from the PGA and then golfers who have switched to the Champions Tour, so the Senior Tour. So these are people that still play golf a heck of a lot. They're still training. They're still getting as many rounds in as possible. They're still competing against top competitors. If we're able to maintain high levels of involvement, we can expect to maintain these levels of functioning for a lot longer than we think we can. Okay? So the evidence actually doesn't fit the stereotype that in our older life needs to be an inevitable cascade of declining function. That's not true. Sometimes, and most of the time, maybe it looks like that, but has nothing to do with age and everything to do with disuse, everything to do with discontinuing things. I'll give you an example. I have a grandmother. She's 93 now. But when she was in her 70s, she used to take her grandkids and my uncle down to one of those Six Flags parks in the US. And she would go down there and she would sit on the bench all day. And I would say, when we started to do work in this area, I would say, Grandma, why would you do that? And she said, well, I'm getting old, I need to rest. That's the message that a lot of people subscribe to about what older life needs to look like. That's the worst attitude to have, because what it does is it stops her from doing the small amounts of physical activity that she would need to do in order to maintain the function that she has at the moment. Instead of that, she's endorsing this idea that older people need to slow down, they need to stop being active because they're not capable of doing that. That's the exact opposite of the message we should be giving them. If you want to maintain function, if you want to maintain memory and your ability to do crosswords and all those kind of things that older people have value in, we need to be challenging those things now more than ever in your lifespan. Somehow that message doesn't get out. Another question that we've started to look at is whether master athletes really represent the ideal model of the aging process. So, on the one hand, they have amazing physical abilities. They are, one of the reasons we plot them on our age profile graph is because they represent the optimal level of functioning for older people. But we need to remember that health is not a single dimension, right? Health is a balance of all of these qualities. So physical is important, yes, but what about the social? What about the emotional? We have very little understanding of how master athletes look in these other dimensions of health. And we've been doing this work for 3 World Masters Games now. And some of the master athletes I meet are obsessive. And I wonder whether they see costs in other areas of health, whether they have a good connection with their families, whether they have a good social network that they can use. I also wonder whether not buying into the stereotype of aging. So a lot of older master athletes believe that they can beat aging until they eventually just fall over and die. They don't believe it exists. Well, it does exist, and saying it doesn't is not going to prevent it from happening to you one day. Eventually, near the end of their lives, they're going to likely experience some form of chronic disease. And I wonder whether their ability to handle that diagnosis is going to be compromised because they don't understand the social implications of aging. Right? We fight that as a society, but it's a reality for a lot of people. Eventually, chronic conditions, yes, we want to make sure that we have as long a lifespan without chronic disease as possible, but with medical technology, most of us are going to experience some form of chronic care at the end of our lives. Now, we can say that that's just part of the process, and we organize our lives so that that happens at the end, and we use that to get our affairs in order and to make our natural transition to the next phase, whatever that phase is. Or we can fight it and have an absolute terrible experience during that phase of life, which is a very important phase of life. And I'm not sure master athletes will be able to handle that. And so these are some of the questions that we're exploring right now. Yeah, it's great to maintain physical function as long as possible, but what happens when we can't anymore? Right? We don't have the data on people in the ages of 90 and over 100. People over 100 is the largest growing cohort of our population. We know almost nothing about them, about the level of functioning that they have and how we can optimize their health when they get there. But the majority, or not majority, but a large number of people in this room are going to live to be over the age of 100. We need to do more work in this area. Health is multidimensional. It's also dynamic and interactive. So physical health will affect social and emotional health, but the relationship also goes the other way. If we maintain our social connections, if we maintain a positive attitude, we see that that improves our physical function as well. So we need to optimize the aging process across all of those dimensions, not just focusing on the physical. Okay, focusing on the physical is something that the World Health Organization did away with in 1946. Right? We stopped looking at health as being the absence of disease. But we still endorse that as a society, that health looks like high levels of functioning and not having heart disease. Well, no, you can have heart disease and be a healthy person. You can have arthritis, manage it well, and be healthy because your social health is high or your emotional health is high. And so it's a balance of these dimensions that is what we're aiming for. So I'll finish by looking at what we can learn from older athletes to help us age based on the research that we've done. The first thing is don't let yourself be defined by an aging stereotype. Okay? Don't buy into that message. So the resistance that you show to buying into that message is an important predictor of how healthy you'll be and how high your quality of life will be later in your older life experience. Keep learning. Keep learning new things. Learn a language, learn a musical instrument, whatever. One of the really cool findings that we've seen over gerontological research in the last decade, notice my pause for a dramatic effect, is that our brain never loses the ability to learn new things. Right? Yeah, we might see synaptic activity decline as we get older, but our brain never loses the ability to learn. So challenge it. That's our main conclusion. Maintain your social connections. Too often, one of the things we see in older people is almost a drawing away from society. Don't do that. Go out, volunteer, challenge yourself, maintain those social connections that you have. Oftentimes we see older people, their social connections are almost always around family. Expand that social group if you can. Join a seniors club or a community care center. Get involved with your communities. Those social connections are important. We can use social connections, how many social connections people have, to predict the quality of their life experience. And the big conclusion is to keep challenging yourself, no matter what your age is. And this isn't just physical challenge, but cognitive challenge. All of those things are really necessary, not only to maintain the function that you have, but to improve the function so that a year from now your function is higher than it is at the moment. That's not an impossible dream. That's a reality for most people because they're nowhere near what their potential is. These are some pictures we took at the World Masters Games in Italy a couple of years ago. And I'll leave you with this quote from the great Maurice Chevalier that old age is not something we should be negative about. This is great, right? The alternative to this is not great. And so that's the way we need to be thinking about this process. So this is my contact information. If anybody has questions, we'll have some time now, but if you're like me, your questions will come when you're driving home. And if you want to contact us about any of the work that we're doing, we're happy to share any of this stuff. And I'll end by this plug for a study that we're doing right now with older adults looking at efficiency going up and down stairs. So if anyone is interested in this work or any of the other work that we're doing, please let us know. And thanks for your attention. This was a lot of fun, and I'm happy to answer any questions.